He woke with his wrists raw from robes, the taste of iron in his mouth, and the echo of cloistered laughter ringing in the marble vaults above him. Hands he had trusted had dragged him through corridors of velvet and confession, deposited him naked and trembling before men in robes, who treated his body as a demonstration of power. He rose, pressing his palms to bruised skin, and found only indifference in the eyes that had the power to condemn or protect. If you enjoy these dark histories, leave a like and subscribe. Comment below where you're listening from. I'm genuinely curious to know where these stories reach. The scene resolves into records, a clerk's shorthand, an ambassador's dispatch, a diary entry. Those dry words map the cruelty. They name perpetrators, orderers, and bystanders. They reveal how institutions that preach salvation could marshal terror. This is where our investigation begins. Inside documents and bones that refuse to lie. The ledger and the diary are the first lights we follow. Joannes Burchard's meticulous entries, ceremonial notes that bleed into personal horror, describe banquets that inverted ritual, where liturgy softened into pageant and confession into spectacle. Ambassadors from Venice, Milan, and Ferrara wrote home in alarm, their letters cataloguing bribes, lubricious entertainments, and the systematic purchase of offices. Those are not inventions of polemic. They are repeated observations from different hands across years. Close reading of these sources yields patterns, simony, patronage used as currency for flesh and silence, and a bureaucratic state that normalized vice. The documents point to particular figures and to institutional mechanisms, court finances, papal chambers, the small army of servants who kept secrets. From these instruments grew the theatre of excess we will trace. Among the earliest and most scandalous names is John Dwan, an 11th century pontiff whose contemporaries accused him of turning the Lateran into a house of revelry. Chroniclers like Ludbrand of Cremona offer indictments. Brothel run within papal precincts. Lover households patronized by the papacy itself, and allegations of incest among close relatives. Whether every accusation is true must be weighed. Medieval chroniclers wrote polemic as much as record, but archaeological and archival traces support a core reality. The papal court was not uniformly austere. Stones from demolished dwellings, payrolls for servants paid to accommodate guests, and legal complaints from families appear in archives. Those fragments create a mosaic that complicates the sanctified image of the office. To understand John Dye's indictment in context, one must read the political climate. The papacy then was a territorial lordship as much as a spiritual office. Power, money, and sex were instruments of patronage. Nobles expected favors. Women were assets, sometimes offered in marriages, sometimes used as rewards. When a pope used his position to secure loyalty through intimate arrangements, he was following an established logic of medieval power. That does not excuse the abuses, only situates them. Primary evidence suggests that the coupling of temporal authority and private indulgence was a feature of medieval media, and that later Renaissance successors were an amplification of an older pattern. The accusation of incest is one of the most shocking. If true, it testifies to the dissolution caused by unchecked authority, but it remains contested in sources. Transitioning into the Renaissance, the institutional conduits that allowed John the allegations to fester had become more elaborate. The papal household expanded. Court offices were sold. Patronage networks grew denser. The archival trace we follow includes fiscal ledgers like the Fondopio, letters from ambassadors and notarial records. In these texts, a new name appears with catastrophic force: Rodrigo Borja. He worked the system with a clarity of purpose, combining family strategy, money, and ruthlessness. The documents show purchases, payments, and a pattern of promoting relatives into ecclesiastical positions. That practice, nepotism, would reshape the church in ways contemporaries found scandalous. Rodrigo Borja's election, the sources insist, was less an act of divine selection than a transaction. Ambassadors recorded promises, bribes, and whispered agreements. Cardinals led list expenses that correspond to votes. Once in power, the Pope's household became an instrument of dynastic ambition. He maintained liaison outside clerical norms, bestowed benefices on offspring, and turned access into currency. Those acts are better documented than the salacious tableau that later writers described, yet the latter are present too. Dispatches and diaries note lentious entertainments, and a court that blurred the sacred and the profane. In archival traces, we see both the administrative and the theatrical combined. The archival account of the Borga court converges on particular rituals. Jones Birch records banquets that read like catalogues of transgression, naked performers, objects of display, and a competitive humiliation in the name of amusement. One repeated tale involves 50 women presented in the Pope's private apartments and invited to perform degrading tasks while high officials judged. Bard's Latin is plain. He records events without rhetorical flourish, and that weight of apparent sobriety makes his entries hard to dismiss. Cross-corroboration appears in Venetian dispatches that describe similar excesses, and in marginal scribbles that note payments to families for silence. The implication of such spectacles is not merely moral collapse, but the instrumentalization of bodies for political ends. Women brought to the papal court were frequently tied to negotiations. Daughters of noble families, courtesans whose silence could be bought. The financial records in the Vatican archives sometimes list these transactions under vague headings: donations, charity, or aids to the household. And marginal notes portray a different motive: protection for the Pope's reputation or leverage to secure loyalty. The pattern repeats. Civic institutions collude in secrecy, and the veneer of piety is maintained publicly, while private systems of reward and coercion operate behind closed doors. One of the most persistent documentary threads concerns fraudulent elections and simony. The era's legal notaries preserved contracts and receipts payments annotated with recipients' names, dates, and sums. In one ledger under the Fondopio Code, a secretary's marginalia refers bluntly to a large payment described officially as charity, but annotated informally as a bribe for silence. The pattern shows an economy of corruption. Offices were sold, benefices exchanged for cash, and the church's fiscal machinery was repurposed to protect private indulgence. Diplomatic correspondence frames these practices as ordinary politics. Moral outrage appears in fewer limited quarters. The sale of offices had cascading effects. Clerical posts became instruments for family arrondissement. Young men of non-vocational inclination received benefices and titles not for pastoral competence, but to secure property and influence. That is how Kesabura, initially a cardinal by papal favour, transitioned into a military commander and secular prince. The sources describe a court where ecclesiastical promotion served dynastic strategy. These choices changed the administration of the church, fueling resentment and reformist critique that would later feed movements for change. Administrative files and personal letters exposed the transactional nature of ecclesiastical life in this period. The human cost of these political economies shows in the stories of women and families. Diplomatic dispatches recount mothers who sold daughters into silence, payments accepted in exchange for reputational protection. There are legal complaints, dowries diverted, marriages annulled under suspicious terms, and convent vows imposed on women who are promised not to speak. Archaeological traces, sealed letters, household inventories, and convent admission logs show a systemic practice. Not every story is fully documented. Many women leave no paper trail. But the surviving records, when read together, portray a pattern of coerced compliance and institutional complicity. Contemporary observers recorded cases with names that reappear across sources. Dora Caracciolo's case is one cited repeatedly, a noble woman removed from her family and held in papal apartments, according to several accounts, until her family accepted terms to preserve their honor. Whether every detail in these stories can be independently verified, the stack of independent reports, the ambastorial letters, local chronicles, and marginalia in official books, creates a presumption that coercion was a tool of policy. The institutional response involved payment, exile, or religious confinement, methods that served both to silence and to legitimize the outcomes administratively. The Buia court's appetite for security extended to poison and murder. Chroniclers and ambassadors routinely attribute sudden deaths among cardinals and rivals to deliberate assassination. Contemporary autopsy is rare, but patterns emerge: unexpected deaths, followed by rapid confiscation of assets and swift paper appointments that placed benefices in the hands of loyalists. Testimony and diplomatic papers hints at poison obtained through courtly channels. The historical evidence is inferential. Circumstantial facts arrange to suggest intent, but the density of such incidents is historically notable and supported by multiple independent observers. Poison became a political instrument, and stories of perfumed chalices and tainted food circulate in numerous dispatches. Chroniclers like Francesco Giardini reflect on the politics of the age with wary candor. The lines between war and assassination, conquest and murder dissolved. Those who served power learned to adopt methods that were efficient and untraceable. The administrative archives show how estates were redistributed after sudden deaths, and how papal favors quickly filled vacuums. The mechanisms of impunity were institutional: control of courts, influence over judges, and the economic means to buy silence. The transformation of public ritual into private indulgence is captured in the same records: the record charity and building projects, the Sign Chapels Commission, and the expansion of St. Repeaters occurred simultaneously with private expenditures that financed courts of pleasure. Artists and architects received generous patronage, their contracts preserved in Ontario books, while side ledgers reveal payments that do not fit public accounts. Payments to households, to entertainers, to merchants who supplied delicate goods for private apartments. The same man who commissioned masterpieces also staffed his household with secretaries whose job was concealment. Historians must reconcile the coexistence of civic patronage and private vice. Payments in the paper account books are plain evidence that money moved both to public works and into private circuits. Ambassadors recorded processions and public piety, while noting with contempt the private pageantry. This duplicity is not merely moral hypocrisy. It is institutional functioning. Funds intended to solidify spiritual authority were diverted to secure temporal loyalty, and the consequences were structural. Families rose by association with the papal household, and political alliances hardened into systems of mutual protection for vice. Lucretia Borgia is a figure who illustrates how women in papal circles navigated power and vulnerability. Contemporary sources paint her alternately as victim, instrument, and agent. Her marriages were political contracts negotiated by papal will, and her person became a pawn in larger dynastic strategies. Letters and legal documents record diaries, property transfers, and the terms of marital settlements, which often serve to consolidate boer territorial ambitions. The documentary record complicates biography. Lucre's agency appears limited on paper, yet she cultivated cultural patronage and correspondence that hint at personal strategies of survival. The archival traces surrounding Lucia also reveal a softer, but no less strategic side: patronage of artists, letter writing, and careful management of estates. That management required public performance and private negotiation. Her situation demonstrates how women embedded within corrupt systems could still exert influence, albeit constrained by the mechanisms that used them. Sources show she received gifts, estates, and titles. They also show how these assets served the Borgia network. Her story, preserved in contracts and private correspondence, illuminates the institutional logic that converted intimacy into currency. Cesare Borgia's career exemplifies the conflation of clerical office and military ambition. Appointed cardinal at a young age because of family ties, he later resigned his ecclesiastical promises to become a secular prince and general. Machiavelli would later study and condemn the methods of statecraft he practiced: terrifying efficiency, targeted violence, and the consolidation of rule through fear. His military campaigns, recorded in dispatches and military correspondence, reveal a campaign of conquest that looked more like private war than papal action. Those campaigns depended on papal resources and the impunity his lineage afforded. The sources show Ces's ruthless sieges, summary executions, and political marriages. Local chroniclers document uprisings crushed, towns punished, and families dispossessed. He used papal bulls and diplomatic weight to legitimize territorial seizures. The administrative correspondence indicates a deliberate strategy. Accumulate land and power under the Borgia name, then secure the legal instruments that made possession permanent. Those instruments, decrees, patents, and grants survived in archives, linking paperwork to violence and showing how ecclesiastical authority was retold for dynastic expansion. The institutional architecture that allowed these abuses, clerical privilege, fiscal opacity, and control of legal forums did not emerge overnight. Sixtus-IV's earlier reign provides pivotal precedents. Records show how curial offices were transformed into political tools and how papal finances were used to secure civic influence in the Italian peninsula. Sixtus' appointments and investments normalized the sale of influence, creating an administrative culture that made Rodrigo Borgia's later excess appear as an extreme but comprehensible continuation. Administrative continuity explains how corruption reproduced itself. Notarial books, papal bulls, and curial correspondence show a bureaucracy skilled at reconciling moral rhetoric with transactional reality. That institutional ingenuity produced plausible deniability, expenditures labeled as charity, favors recorded as benefits, and coerced agreements entered as consent. Understanding the bureaucratic language is essential to decoding how private vice appeared publicly as governance. The archival voice is dry, but it reveals the engineering of impunity. Scattered among the grand narratives are the quieter documents of ordinary suffering, convent registers noting unusual admissions, baptismal records that show children of uncertain paternity, and legal petitions of families seeking restitution. These records are mundane, their ink faded, but together they map the social damage. Women confined to convents, children granted minor titles without legitimate claims, and families forced into silence appear across municipal archives. This is the shadow population produced by institutional predation. The social consequences extended beyond individual stories. Popular piety continued in public, while private confidence in clerical virtue waned among certain circles. Chroniclers recorded murmurs and satire. Plays and poems mocked hypocrisy. Yet institutional power made organized challenge difficult. The archives preserve both complaint and acquiescence, petitions that ask for redress and payments that secure silence. These documents together suggest a society negotiating the reality of sacrilege and survival. External observers, diplomats, foreign envoys, and foreign chroniclers offer a different vantage. Their dispatches to courts in Venice, France, and Spain often display political motives, but they also describe events with immediacy. The Venetian Senate's dispatches are particularly valuable. They catalogue not only scandal, but the operational circuits, who paid whom, which households were implicated, and how the rumor networks functioned. Their interest was both moral and strategic. Scandals were useful intelligence. These foreign papers influenced domestic perception. Reports sent to royal courts could become fuel for political opposition. They also produced a corroborating cross-check. When multiple independent ambassadors describe the same courtly spectacles, the convergence increases credibility. We must read these reports critically, recognizing bias, but their consistency about key patterns strengthens the historical case that corruption and private vice were embedded features of Renaissance papal politics. In the records, the line between ritual and spectacle blurs. Liturgical ceremony became an occasion for display, and display became a stage for private contests. The Berkshire Diary describes rituals of humiliation performed in quasi-religious settings. Ritual elements, processional torches, sacramental space were recast as props. That recasting had a corrosive effect. Sacred items and spaces were instrumentalized for private ends, eroding the boundary between the holy and the profane. The sacrilegious reuse of sacred settings is the most corrosive charge against the Renaissance papal court. Contracts show payments for chapel maintenance, while separate entries fund private apartments within the same palaces. The juxtaposition is obscene in the bureaucratic record. Accounts that track revenue and expenditure make such coexistence undeniable. Public endowment for liturgy, private appropriation for vice. The documents require historians to confront institutional duplicity without recourse to moral theatrics. The culture of secrecy was enforced by intermediaries, secretaries, chamberlains, and clerks whose livelihoods depended on discretion. Their marginalia in official books sometimes betrays personal disgust. Other times it records surgical compliance. Jones Burchard himself is an ambiguous figure, a servant of ceremony who documented without intervening. The personal records of individuals like him are invaluable because they show the human difficulty of speaking truth inside a system that rewards silence. These intermediaries created and maintained the paper trail that protected the powerful. Payment ledgers, sealed notes, and coded language became instruments of protection. Historians working in the archives must learn to read omissions as much as entries. A missing receipt, a deliberately blank margin, a cross-out. Those gestures often signal the presence of things officials wanted to bury. The craft of historical reconstruction depends on attending to these absences as clues to the mechanisms of concealment. Public ritual repair followed scandal. After the most notorious episodes, pontificates attempted image management. Successors enacted reforms, commissioned visible acts of piety, and promoted public works to counterbalance scandal. Yet, document trails indicate that these measures were often cosmetic. A new chapel could be funded at the same time that private stipends continued to underwrite courts of indulgence. The archive gives us both the remedy and the persistence of the disease. Reformers, clerics, lay intellectuals, and political rivals use the archival record as ammunition. Their pamphlets, treatises, and polemical letters cite specific malpractices. The pressure these writings created contributed to eventual institutional changes, including later reform movements. But the archive also shows resistance. Those who benefited from the old orders fought back, and the patterns of patronage were resilient. The documents thus narrate a slow, contested battle over the Church's moral authority. The archaeological record complements texts. Excavations of palatial foundations turn up tokens, fragments of chalices, discarded jewelry, and architectural layers that reveal private apartments converted from former sacral rooms. Material finds corroborate documentary hints of coexistence, public chapels adjacent to luxury suites. These material traces do not speak in sentences, but they add weight to the narrative built from paper that sacred spaces were repurposed and commodities of pleasure circulated within the orbit of spiritual authority. The material culture also reveals everyday routines, kitchenware matching banquet accounts, latrine deposits that show consumption of luxuries, and personal items that belong to servants whose names appear in the ledgers. Together, objects and texts create a fuller picture of how the papal household functioned, as both spiritual center and courtly establishment. Archaeology anchors archival interpretation and prevents any romantic reading of patronage that ignores the human costs recorded in mundane refuse. The international repercussions of papal vice had political consequences. Monarchs used reports of corruption as pretext for negotiating territorial claims, extracting concessions, or asserting influence over Italian affairs. Papal malfeasance weakened the moral authority that Rome claimed, and rival courts exploited that weakness. Diplomatic correspondence preserved in national archives reveals how scandal was weaponized in interstate diplomacy. Yet, political exploitation also complicated simple moral judgment. Foreign powers often exaggerated charges for advantage, and internal critics sometimes mirrored foreign propagandists. The historian's task is to sift advantage from accuracy. Cross-referencing private letters, notarial books, and third-party accounts yields a probabilistic history. Not every rumor is true, but enough independent attestations accumulate to mark systemic failure. The archives show both misuse and manipulation of scandal for political ends. The death of a notorious pope offers a case study in institutional paradox. One account reports a papal corpse so decomposed that servants refused to handle it. Others suggest a hurried burial to avoid scandal. Whether the approximate cause was disease or poison Records of estate settlement and burial logistics reveal panic and secrecy. Rapid inventories were taken, property transferred. Those procedural acts, documents drawn hastily, signatures secured, are historiographic gold. They show the final bureaucratic choreography that followed scandal and death. The immediate aftermath of such deaths reshaped power relations. Successors moved quickly to secure legitimacy, either by distancing themselves from the excesses or by co-opting the institutional apparatus. The archives show both strategies, proclamations of reform alongside quiet continuities. That tension between public denunciation and private persistence frames the long arc of papal reform and reveals how institutions can absorb scandal and survive, often by transforming rather than eradicating abusive practices. To conclude the narrative, one must ask what the documents teach us about power and sanctity. The records do not simply indict individual men. They expose a system that allowed privilege to be converted into license. The Birchard Diary, narial ledgers, ambassadorial dispatches, and archaeological layers together argue for structural culpability.